these ancient sites continue to play a critical role. For example, if we return back to the Western Wall, Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif complex, if we look at episodes of violence between Israelis and Palestinians in the course of the 20th and into the early 21st century, a not insignificant number of them were prompted by events that took place at that site. So the disturbances that erupted in 1929 had to do in large measure with the status of the performance of Jewish worship in front of the Western Wall. Or if we look at, in 1996, Israel's opening of the expanded tunnel along the Western Wall that leads from the Kotel, the Western Wall Plaza north, and ultimately one exits in the Muslim quarter. So it's a tunnel, a subterranean tunnel along the Western Wall that is really absolutely fascinating in terms of what it reveals archaeologically, but terrified, aroused Palestinian fears that Israel was trying in some way to undermine the foundations of the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the opening of that tunnel in the fall of 1996 triggered 3 days of rioting that left approximately 100 people dead. The most famous example would be Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount late in the summer of 2000, which helped trigger, or which, in the aftermath of which was the second Intifada, the so-called Al-Aqsa Intifada, after the mosque that's located there, ensued. And then, of course, most recently, the events of this summer, which had to do again with security, or the lack of security on that site. So this is a site that very, very easily, even the slightest change, the slightest provocation can create tremendous disturbances. So one goes without saying, one needs to tread with caution whenever one approaches the site. So that's really, in a way, the best example. The Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron continues to be a flashpoint, and again, it's very, very hard to resolve, because one of the difficulties here is what kind of resolution does one make? Now, in the case of the Temple Mount Western Wall, it's actually quite interesting to note that Israel, the Jewish state, the self-declared Jewish state, actually forbids Jews from praying on the Temple Mount, which is the holiest site for the Jewish people. So even as Israel has proclaimed that a united Jerusalem will be its eternal capital under its sovereignty, it has, and it's therefore against, officially at least, partitioning the city into western and eastern halves. It actually has, in effect, partitioned this most holy of sites into the Western Wall as the Jewish holy site and the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif as the Muslim holy site. In a way, trying to evade the fact that it's actually the Temple Mount that is really the most holy site for Judaism, and also passing over the fact that the Western Wall also has religious significance for Muslims. So in a way, there we have a partition. As difficult as it is logistically possible at the site, and has in fact been carried out. In Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah, the situation is much more difficult because we're dealing with one discrete structure. And so what's been resolved upon there is that there are certain portions of it that are largely in Muslim control, portions that are largely in Jewish control, and then on certain select days, each side takes on complete control. So I believe it's actually only 10 days of the year that Jews actually have sort of complete rights to the entire site for prayer. So it's perhaps the best that one can do to create this kind of partition in both space and in time. Because of course the question arises, well, what if Israel were simply to withdraw from Hebron entirely? Could Jewish access to the site be maintained? And one, of course, recalls that according to the ceasefire at the end of the War of Independence in 1949, there was still supposed to be a Jewish right of access to the Western Wall, but in practice there was not. So one fears that the same thing, and indeed there wasn't access to the cave of Machpelah in Hebron also. But of course, it's a very delicate site because it's located at the center of a quite large Palestinian city that only contains several hundred, a population of several hundred Jewish settlers in its heart. So it's really, there's sort of an enduring stalemate in Hebron with no real clear resolution in sight. Another great example of how an ancient site, in a way, takes on a new life in modern times concerns Masada, which is geographically perhaps the most impressive of the symbolic spaces and places in modern Israel. It's a massive mountaintop, isolated mountaintop in the Judean desert with a spectacular view over the surrounding terrain, including the Dead Sea. So it's just a massive it's a massive outcropping in the midst of the desert, extremely stark landscape, isolated from larger settlements. So it's an extremely moving and powerful experience just to be there, never mind the history surrounding it. But the history is fascinating because it was the last outpost, the last holdout in the great Jewish revolt in antiquity against the Romans. And even though it was a very extremist, fanatical Jewish sect that had basically taken hold of this, what had been a fortress, constructed by King Herod prior to that. And even though they, in the end, so far as we can tell from the account in the ancient historian Josephus, rather than fight against the Romans and suffer certain defeat, basically committed mass suicide. Despite that, the site became a symbol for the fight to the bitter end, refusing to give in, fighting against the odds, and has loomed especially large, really has become, in many respects, symbolic of Israel as a whole. So just to give you some wonderful examples of just how powerful this Masada symbolism is. At one point in time, the arrival terminal for the older Israeli airport was called the Masada Hall. So it's as if when you arrived in Israel, you were arriving in Masada. And Masada, in the 90s, I encountered a fascinating statistic that 1/4 of all tourists who came to Israel visited Masada. And I doubt that those numbers have changed so much a generation later. So this is a site that is just very much on the map, so to speak, even though in ancient times, the group that came there was, again, really a very, very marginal sect. Even if the incidents that took place there were basically, it was really just the last episode of a revolt that had largely had fizzled out 2-3 years prior to that. Even though for much of Jewish history, Masada as a site, as an event, had been largely forgotten, nonetheless, in modern times, in the context of the Zionist movement, Masada came to symbolize resistance, fighting, standing up for oneself. And this, I think, to a large degree was suggested even just by the very geographical form of the place, the fact that it is so high, again, in particular, with regard to the surroundings. It really very much seemed to embody the aim of ascent to a higher place for the Jewish people that Zionism sought for. And it seemed, because it represents, again, a kind of isolated mountaintop, seemed to very much reflect, to symbolize Israel's place in its surrounding as a kind of, as a country for many decades at war with all of its neighbors, and even today, peace treaties have been signed with 2 of its neighbors still, with a lot of tensions in its neighborhood, so to speak. Masada really exemplified this in a powerful way. Of course, there have been, beginning in the 90s in particular, there have been powerful critiques of this celebration of Masada. So in earlier decades, army units would hike up to the site and take their oaths to serve the state at Masada and so forth. There've been, more recently, critiques. There've been really bracing critiques of what's been referred to as the Masada myth, But nonetheless, Masada, the aura of Masada continues to endure in our own time. So I think it's one of the best testimonies of how an ancient site, even one that had been largely forgotten, well nigh forgotten for centuries, can really take on new life and indeed attain a prominence in contemporary times that it never had in antiquity.